Christoph. I'm one of the two supervisors, Nick Parry, who's going to be presenting his the completion seminar today. The other being Professor Philo Murray from politics. We've had the extraordinary pleasure of supervising Nick over a number of years now to see this thesis coming to fruition. I'm sure everyone in this room is equally obsessed with and puzzled by the problems of decarbonisation, and in particular the ways in which different states, different countries, and I try not to mention Australia, which is a bottomless pit for broken hearts in this particular matter, how different countries have moved towards sometimes more aggressive, sometimes more successful, and sometimes not terribly successful programs and targets in the implementation of renewable energy and the transformation of their energy sectors. The European Union, of course, is a particularly interesting example of transition and transformation. But within the EU, though the EU itself has been reasonably successful in doing what it's done, within the EU there have been a range of very different types of challenges because of the types of states that the EU is comprised of. And one of the reasons I think Nick's thesis is so interesting is that he's taken a very close look, a very detailed look at two very different types of states within the EU. I can still say that until Brexit, October 31, though hopefully that may not happen. Philo is the expert on this. But there are the two case studies that he's looked at of the UK and France provide very powerful contrasting states struggling with a common directive which has tried to draw the EU into that new and different space. And it's this contrast between states and the puzzles and problems that go with driving states into this new world that Nick's been particularly focused on. The problems of institutional persistence, path dependency, very different types of state approaches to policy development and policy implementation at the heart of this thesis. So without further ado, Nick.
I'd like to begin just by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. Pay my respects to their elders, past and present. So, good start. One button. Yeah, you can spend 4 years doing a thesis and you can't turn a microphone on. And whilst acknowledging people, look, I want to begin by thanking a few people who've helped me along on this journey, and I'm a bit reluctant to do so because I haven't quite finished. I feel like by thanking people now I might jinx the whole thing, but it's my only opportunity to do so publicly. So I'm going to begin with my two supervisors in Peter Christoph and Philomena Murray. They have complemented each other perfectly on this project. Peter, with his expertise in international climate politics, the quintessential academic, I think, Peter, right down to the poorly upholstered chairs in his office. Peter has always encouraged me to explore questions, and the answers to those questions don't necessarily appear in the final product, but they've certainly given my thesis a more rounded perspective. And Philo, who is the expert, I think, on EU politics in this country and one of the experts in the world, very much appreciated the fact that she came on board early in the project and sort of brought a lot of discipline. I think both Peter and I needed at various times. But as I said, that for all of their expertise and their professionalism, the thing that I valued most is actually their kindness. This is a brutal process. There are times when you question your sanity and your intelligence, but to have two supervisors who can provide the necessary feedback, sometimes critical, but still encourage you to keep going is really, really important. I very much appreciate that. Also to my colleagues here at the Climate and Energy College, this truly is the best place to work that I've ever been in. To quote Donald Trump, we have the best people here. It is everything I think an academic institution should be. One, it's student-led, and second, it's interdisciplinary. So I've had the opportunity to speak with colleagues from social sciences. We talk about theory and we talk about structure. I then talk to my colleagues in engineering who talk about energy systems, the actual infrastructure that delivers the power, and then to talk about the fundamentals of climate science with my science colleagues. And together they've made this thesis a much more rounded project than it otherwise would have been. So thank you to all of those guys. And I apologise too to my science and engineering colleagues. I've been creating charts in Excel, and I know that you'll be outraged by that I haven't used some fancy coding program, but you can't learn everything in 4 years, can you? Finally, to my wife and my family, well, my wife Lauren is down the back there. This is it can be a lonely process at times, and as I said, you sometimes do question your sanity and your intelligence, but to have just one person in the world who does believe in you and does have faith in what you're doing, that's a very powerful thing. And so thank you very much to Lauren. I've got one of my kids here as well. He's chucked a sickie today, so and he's punished by having to listen to this for an hour. So bad luck, I say. We can start. This is the sum of my presentation. Okay, and yeah, so this is my inspiration. These are my 3 kids. It means a lot to me to be able to say to them at some point that I tried to make a difference to the world that they will inherit. I actually had, this is a true story, my 10-year-old asked me on Friday whether Scott Morrison would read my thesis and whether he would change his mind because of it. I said, sure he will, mate, yeah. Santa Claus will deliver it to him on Christmas. It'll be great. So, all right, so what is this thesis about? The Europeanization of the Renewable Energy Directive in France and the United Kingdom. So I'm going to begin by just unpacking this title. Hopefully by doing so, you understand what this project is all about. I'm then going to talk very briefly about some of the theory I've used to answer my core research question. And then I'm going to talk about the actual implementation in France and the United Kingdom. So I begin with this term, Europeanization, and what does it mean? Unless you've studied the EU, it's probably looks like a made-up term, but it's actually a very important term. And at the most basic level, it looks at the impact that the EU has on member states. Okay, so how member states respond to EU institutions, norms, and policies. So that's a very basic view. There is a more nuanced definition that Rodali gives, which I've used in the thesis. You want to press that button, Win? There we go. There it is. I'm not going to read it out, but a couple of key points to note. That is Europeanization of the processes of construction, diffusion, and institutionalization of policy. I'm focusing on policy. They're first defined and consolidated in the EU, at the EU level, and then incorporated into the logic of domestic political structures. So what does that look like on our diagram? Well, this first process that Rodali talks about is construction. This is the policy development phase. So I won't go into the intricacies of EU policy development, but it's obvious that member states try to influence the shape of policy. And what they try to do is to upload their policy preferences to the EU level with the objective of having EU policy mirror as closely as possible domestic policy. And if they can do that, then they minimize the amount of adjustment. Okay, so once that policy has been formalized, if it looks very similar to domestic policy, then the adjustment is minimal. Obviously, some states are better at this. There are more powerful states like Germany and France and the UK, but smaller states can also act very strategically to ensure that their preferences are uploaded. We then talk about the diffusion and institutionalization of these policies. So you've got 28 member states, all of them very, very different, not only differences in size, but differences in political structure, economic structure, languages, culture, etc., etc. And so EU policy is very dependent upon those member states interpreting and implementing the policies. But of course, you've got different institutional structures across 28 member states. So they all behave very differently. And so you have these sort of uneven processes of implementation. Now, those institutions at member states effectively act as a filter. But they also change in response in various ways to the EU. And essentially, this is what Europeanization looks at. It looks at this development of policy and then how institutions interpret, implement, and also change in response. Then going to look at this Renewable Energy Directive. Exactly what is it? Essentially, it sets a 20% renewable energy target by 2020. Within the directive, each member state is set a binding national target, running from 49% for Sweden all the way down for 10% for Malta. Based on a fairly simple formula, it takes into account GDP, renewable energy capacity, and renewable energy potential. Now, This being a directive, and this is a common form of EU policy, particularly in environmental areas, a directive sets an objective, an overall objective and a binding member state objective, but it does not offer policy prescriptions. Okay, so member states then have freedom to choose their own policies to reach those targets. And so at the start of the Renewable Energy Directive period in 2010, member states were required to submit a national renewable energy action plan to the European Commission. And within that, they had to list all of the policies that they were going to implement to reach the target. They also had to indicate interim annual targets and specific targets for the electricity sector, transport, heating and cooling. And the focus of my thesis is on electricity. Electricity, the most important in terms of decarbonisation in the near term. So where does the Renewable Energy Directive sit within the overall framework of EU climate policy? It is one of 4 central pillars. Okay, so you have the emissions trading system, ETS, implemented in 2005. I talk a bit about this in my thesis, but I'm not going to go into detail here. You then have 3 targets for emissions reductions, renewables, and energy efficiency. Okay, each set at 20-20-20. There's a commission official who says they only did that because politicians aren't very clever and they needed something to remember. So it's the emissions reduction target, for instance, could have been a lot higher, but they wanted to keep it even at 20-20-20. Now, the idea is that these targets are updated every 10 years. Okay, so 2030 package was finalised in June of last year. It sets 40% emissions reduction, 32 for renewables and 32.5 for energy efficiency. And the Commission is currently negotiating with its member states to formalise a net zero emissions target by 2050. Now that target, they were hoping to finalise that last month, but it's currently being held up by Poland, essentially. Poland, very coal-dependent state. But depending on how much money they shovel across to the east, it's most likely that target will be finalised by the end of the year. So this target sits within this whole framework, and it's very, very important because if there's a failure to meet the target in 2020, it potentially jeopardises the whole 2050 strategy. It also could undermine the EU's claims to climate leadership. Okay, so this claim to leadership has become a very important part of the EU's self-identity. Okay, they've been very strong in international climate negotiations from Kyoto right through to Paris. So, and because they've stepped it over a 10-year period, a failure to meet the targets in 2020 undermines that 2050 strategy and those claims to leadership. So this is just a sort of visualization of where they're at 2020. So they'll comfortably meet their emissions reduction target. The energy efficiency target is probably unlikely, and the renewables one they will likely meet. And then you see the upward trajectory towards 2030. But implementation across the 28 member states has been uneven. So according to the latest progress report, which was released in April of this year, 11 states will meet their targets. They've already met their targets, in fact. Another 10 states have met interim targets and will likely meet their 2020 targets, but 7 states have not met interim targets and have deemed to be at risk of missing their targets. And amongst those 7 states, 4 of them are amongst the 10 largest states in the EU. It includes France, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Poland. So a failure of even a handful of states could undermine the whole 2020 target. So my thesis was very much interested in these processes of implementation and looking at the different drivers and impediments to implementation at the member state level. So this essentially was my core research question, which is what are the drivers and impediments to the effective implementation of the Renewable Energy Directive in France and the UK. And so I've chosen France and the UK, obviously 2 very large member states, very, very influential. And both of them also accepted very ambitious targets in 2008. So if you look at the UK was very much a laggard in renewable energy up until about 2010. 2010 had less than 5% of final energy consumption coming from renewable energy. But all of a sudden it accepted a target of 31% for 2020. France's target looks a lot less ambitious, but when you consider that between 2005 and 2010, existing hydro capacity made up about 85 to 90% of all renewable capacity. That line actually comes down to somewhere near the UK line, and that ambition is very, very similar. So you have these two large member states who have accepted targets that are above the average within the EU, and I'll talk a little bit about why that happened, and were much, much higher than the trends prior to 2010. But these two member states are also so very, very different, as Peter mentioned. So firstly, in terms of state control of the electricity and gas sector, I use employees as a proxy here rather than market value, because EDF has had a number of write-downs in recent years. But you see that France is still very much a state-owned sector. The state owns 85% of EDF. EDF generates about 85% of all the electricity in France. EDF also owns the transmission lines. They also own the distribution grid. They also own Framatome, who's the nuclear reactor manufacturer as well. So very much a state-controlled industry. The UK, on the other hand, entirely privatised their electricity and gas sector in the 1990s. So almost no state ownership there. Market concentration using the HH index, which is a measure of market concentration. France, the most concentrated market in power generation with the exception of Malta and Cyprus. The United Kingdom, the least concentrated. So as I said, EDF virtually controlling power generation in France. In the UK, there is only one company that controls a share greater than 10%. Remarkably, that's actually EDF, who control the entire nuclear program. So it has been said that the UK is more than happy to accept state ownership in the electricity sector, as long as it's not owned by the Brits. And of course, in terms of power generation, France very much dependent on nuclear energy at about 71%. The average is sort of 71 to 75%. Normally, a couple of plants are offline in 2017 for maintenance, supported by a long-standing hydro program, small amount of non-hydro renewables and coal. The UK, much more diversified mix, gas, nuclear and non-hydro renewables all playing a very important role. And this is figures from 2017. We'll look at how this generation mix has changed a little bit later. So to summarise, you've got France state-controlled, highly concentrated, nuclear dependent. The UK privatised, liberalised and diversified. And so my question at the start of the thesis is, which of these states is going to be better able to manage that transition to renewables? So on one hand, it might have been possible that France, with its very centralised control, would have been able to dictate to EDF what the renewable energy target was that they had agreed to, and ensure a fairly rapid transition. But on the other hand, you've got an entrenched interest in the nuclear lobby, which in fact the nuclear sector is essentially embedded within the state. So that could act as a significant barrier. In the UK, the opposite is true. The government has no direct control over the firms within the sector. So would that lack of control mean that they couldn't push the electricity sector towards renewables quick enough? Or because there were no entrenched interests, was it possible that the UK could just manipulate a few levers to transition within that 10-year period? So back to that research question, and then looking at my hypothesis was that the historical development of state institutions has created path dependency in policy making that determine the ability of the member state to meet the requirements of the directive. So state institutions are obviously extremely important within this process. They're responsible for interpreting this directive and then implementing the policies to achieve that objective. Okay, and the electricity sector is particularly dependent, if not on state control, and certainly on state regulation. And it was my hypothesis that these institutions are the product of very long historical processes. And those historical processes make change very, very difficult. You've got these sort of path-dependent processes, these sort of lock-in mechanisms, which mean that that is very difficult to change in response to a very ambitious renewable energy target. So I'm going to talk very, very briefly now about institutionalism and what it is. But essentially, a theory of institutions must be able to explain how institutions form, how they change or persist, and how they shape behaviour. This is a whole chapter, by the way, in one slide. So that's remarkable to think anyway. So Very briefly, so how do institutions form? As I said, I say they're the result of very long historical processes that are tied very closely to the ideology of the state. And I'll talk a bit about that shortly. How they change or persist. Broadly speaking, there's sort of two mechanisms for change. One is these critical junctures, like major shocks such as World War II or the economic crisis of the 1970s, the oil crisis, which accompanied it. They create these opportunities for change. And we've seen that in electricity sectors of these two countries. And then there's sort of more incremental change that can happen as a result of, might just be the introduction of new ideas or new economic pressures, something along those lines. And that's more what Europeanization is concerned with. And then how they shape behaviour. So institutions essentially limit the range of options open to actors within a particular system. Okay, so well, the hypothesis is that they shape the way people think and the way they behave. I'm going to skip very quickly through these definitions, but looking at I'm just going to grab a glass of water if that's okay. So looking at how I examine these institutions, I've actually broken it into two chapters in my thesis. One which looks at more broadly the institutions of the state, and the other one looking specifically at the institutions of the electricity sector. And I draw upon some of the literature on varieties of capitalism here, which has a lot of parallels with institutionalism. And I begin with this, the ideology of the state. So in the case of France and the UK, so the origins of this statist French model, and of the economic liberal model that we see in the UK. And what I find is that they're very durable, these ideologies. There have been periods of convergence, particularly after World War II, when you saw the sort of convergence around Keynesian ideas. But all the while, this sort of economic liberalism is an undercurrent in the UK, and this sort of statist approach is very much evident in France. And you can probably date that back to even before the Industrial Revolution. I won't go into that just yet. So that ideology then influences the shape of these state institutions. And I break it into sort of policy styles and political parties and the distribution of power. So both France and the UK are majoritarian systems, okay, which is rare within Europe. Most European states have consensual political systems, which means you tend to form coalition governments. Whereas in France and the UK, one party or the other tends to control power. Then looking at administrative traditions and the civil service, I don't think it would be a surprise to anyone to know that the French bureaucracy is very large and it's very strong and it's very centralised. And one of the key things within the French civil service is this engineering tradition, which has existed for a very long time. And what you tend to have is this sort of elite technocracy, as they're called. So that this elite group of bureaucrats who are drawn from the elite engineering schools within France. And that you see that it's very evident within the electricity sector and has been since the grid was first formed in the 1920s. And that small group of elite engineers are very, very powerful. And I'll talk a little bit about that and their influence on policy, particularly the persistence of nuclear in a little while. And then looking at state investment and control, I've already talked about France still being a statist system in the electricity sector, whereas the UK is very much a privatised system. And then I look at the electricity sector and the party positions and policies. And what you find is that this sort of status approach is far more constant in the UK, in France, sorry. Whereas in the UK, you've had these larger swings in sort of changes in ideology since World War II. Again, I'll talk a little bit more about the influence of parties and certain actors. And then government departments and research agencies. France, as I mentioned, very strong technical expertise within their bureaucracy, and also have a very strong research tradition as well. And so the ministry, EDF, and the research agencies have always worked very closely, particularly in the nuclear sector. And so one of my questions is whether or not that sort of structure could transition to renewables, or whether it is so entrenched in nuclear. And then looking at regulatory bodies and firms, particularly their relationship to the state. So the UK's regulatory body, Ofgem, is far more powerful than the French equivalent. Okay, so and it has a much stronger mandate to protect consumers than the French regulator. The French regulator is still very much tied to those the government departments. So it's the UK regulator is far more independent than it is in France. So I'm now going to talk about the implementation of these policies, but I adopt a sort of approach where I look at the policy history, starting from about 1990, okay, when the consensus around climate change became apparent. And in France, between 1990 and 2008, France very much rested on its laurels, because between 1973 and 2000, they built 58 nuclear reactors. They took the share of nuclear from 7% to 77% during that 25-year period. And what that did was obviously reduce their emissions very significantly. And so France would go to negotiations with the EU and go to Kyoto and say, look at our amazing record. Everyone should be more like us. Of course, their transition to to nuclear had nothing to do with emissions. It was also to do with energy security. But it essentially allowed France to do very, very little up until sort of 2008. And in fact, when the Renewable Energy Directive was being formulated in 2006, Jacques Chirac, the president at the time, argued very strongly that the wording should be low carbon energy rather than renewable energy. Obviously, then they would then receive some credit for nuclear energy. That was actually quashed by Angela Merkel in a European Council meeting. And so eventually that term was removed, and renewables became the accepted term. But then you have this sort of period of ambition, 2008 to 2017. And one of the interesting things about the development of the Renewable Energy Directive was Nicolas Sarkozy, the role that he played. France actually held the rotating presidency of the European Council during the final negotiations of this Renewable Energy Directive. And Sarkozy, known as the hyper president, was very much concerned about building a legacy. And he went to that meeting along with his environment minister, Jean-Louis Borloo, and he sort of railroaded the other countries through to accepting these targets, including France, targets that weren't accepted by his own administration. Right, so it was sort of this very much a French tendency to try and claim a position of leadership, and you see that through many reports up until 2008. So even though he didn't have the agreement of his administration, he went to that EU meeting, accepted a very ambitious target, and also pushed other states to also agree to their ambitious targets. But by sort of 2010, you already started to see some backtracking as sort of reality set in, because there was a sort of contradiction between this renewable energy target and the reality of having nuclear power. Because if they were to increase their renewable capacity to meet the Renewable Energy Directive target, they would have to decommission some of their nuclear capacity. There was a role for gas to play. Gas is important in France. A small amount of gas is for peaking in the winter months, because most of French heating is electric. So from 2010, you already started to see these reversals. But then when President Hollande was elected, he took to that election a very strong climate and energy policy. And so between 2012 and 2015, they developed this energy transition law. And as part of that law, there was a commitment to reduce nuclear from 75% to 50% by 2025, which was fairly remarkable when you understand the influence of nuclear power in France. But again, there was this commitment, but there was no plan to support it. So there was only one plant identified for closure, a very old plant in Fessenheim near the German border. And even the government planning report that followed it, it identified a maximum nuclear closure by 2025, which would bring nuclear down to 60%, nowhere near the 50%. So this is what Hayward identifies as dual policy style in France. So you have, he identifies two types of policy making. There's this sort of heroic style and then this humdrum style, what he calls. So this heroic style, as I said, is this sort of French tendency to put itself in a position of leadership, particularly in technology, to make these sort of grand plans, these grand projects. But what you see in the case of renewable energy, there was a disconnect between this heroic policy making, which is sort of made at the executive level, and what the very powerful bureaucracy was willing to accept. Okay, so when you have this misalignment, you have these very grand, ambitious and very grand commitments, but you don't have the reality on the ground, because you still have a bureaucracy that's tied very, very closely to EDF. EDF is obviously has an interest in continuing its nuclear program. And so you get to this point in 2017 where you see more and more reversals. So that 2025 date is pushed out by 10 years. It's now out to 2035. Nicolas Hulot, who was a very sort of the David Attenborough of France, who became the energy minister under Macron, he actually resigned his position live on radio shortly after it was announced that this nuclear drawdown was being pushed back by 10 years. And another former, there's been a series of resignations in the environment minister. There was another former environment minister who said that the CEO of EDF is effectively a shadow energy minister within France. So and it is EDF who sets energy policy. So it's all well and good for the executive to set these objectives, but if they don't have the agreement of EDF and that elite group of policymakers in the bureaucracy, then it's not going to happen. So looking now at the UK. So we had Margaret Thatcher actually accepted the science around climate change very early. Gave two important speeches, one in 1988, one in 1990. I think in her later years, she saw it as a socialist plot, so changed her mind. But while she was in power, very much accepted the science of climate change. And there was a paper commissioned in 1990, which had a very broad remit. But the recommendations that came out of that were very much market-based, and it was very much around sort of voluntary industry commitments. So there was, whilst there was this acceptance, there was no firm policy in place to actually change anything, and that continued right through in Blair's first term as Prime Minister. But then you had this extraordinary change within the UK from 2005 onwards. A number of factors contributed to that. One, again, like Sarkozy, Blair had this desire to establish a legacy, particularly after the Iraq War. He went to a G8 meeting in 2005 and put two issues on the agenda. One was poverty in Africa, and the other one was climate change. You then had the Stern Review, which had been commissioned by Blair, which came out. There was a lot of publicity around that, obviously, and all of a sudden the political salience of climate change rose within the UK. You also had an opposition leader in David Cameron, who set very ambitious climate policy. He was trying to distance himself from the sort of Thatcherite policies, was trying to soften the image of the Conservative Party. And so Blair was in danger of being outflanked, both on the right by the Conservative Party and on the left by the growing influence of the Greens. And so that drove the Labor government to greater ambition. And in 2008, they implemented the Climate Change Act, which at the time was regarded as one of the most ambitious pieces of climate policy. It set an emissions reduction goal of 85% by 2050. It established the Committee on Climate Change, which was an expert group that set 5-year carbon budgets out to 2050. And it set a number of other targets. That Climate Change Act has sort of acted as a bit of a model too for other countries around the world. I know the Victorian Climate Change Act was based very much on that act. And so it's within this atmosphere that the UK accepted those very ambitious targets for 2020 within the Renewable Energy Directive, and also its emissions reductions. But then you start to see this change after 2010. So 2010 to 2015, you had a coalition government in place. You had the effects of the global financial crisis starting to bite. And all of a sudden, David Cameron started to change his tune. I mean, very famously, he said, get rid of all that green crap, having been a champion of very strong climate and energy policy prior to that. But because that 2008 climate change act, it established a very strong legislative and institutional foundation. Okay, so by setting the 2050 target, by having a mechanism where carbon budgets had to be set every 5 years, it essentially locked in a certain amount of action. It wasn't perfect by any stretch. The UK is not on track to meet its 4th and 5th carbon budgets at this stage. There was also some policy reversals in renewable energy, which meant that it became less attractive place to invest. But because of that activity between 2005 and 2010, the UK had already been put on a very strong path towards its 2020 goals. Okay, so this is a period also of ideological limbo, as it's been called, because so the UK has these neoliberal principles, but increasingly the state has had to intervene in the electricity market to achieve certain objectives. So in the renewable sector, obviously it's offering subsidies. It did have a sort of technology neutral approach in 2010, but when it found that certain technologies were being underdeveloped and there was a lot of resistance to onshore wind, they started this process of banding. So they were trying very much to encourage certain technologies. And then I think the nuclear example is quite instructive. So in order to achieve those emissions objectives by 2050, the government saw nuclear playing a very significant role. It initially thought it would open itself to the market and have the best price come forward. But of course, they've found that it's very difficult to incentivize large-scale generation within a privatized market. So they eventually had to do a deal with EDF, where they've guaranteed EDF a wholesale price on its new nuclear plant of £92.50, indexed for 35 years. The current wholesale price in the UK is about £35. So at the time, it was about double. It's now close to triple what the wholesale price is. And they also had to offer EDF some significant loan guarantees as well. So the UK has been increasingly compromising these neoliberal principles to achieve those outcomes and to achieve its objectives. So where are they at? The UK has actually done remarkably well. This is figures from 2017. They were at 29%. Remembering their final target was 31%. In fact, the provisional figures from 2018 suggest they've already met their electricity target, and so therefore will comfortably surpass that. France, on the other hand, much less successful. Very small increases. Their final target was 27% in the electricity sector. They, of course, will get nowhere near that. And then looking at the generation mix, so France is almost unchanged, right, since 1990. Nuclear, obviously, continuing to play that role with 70+% of generation. Renewables, non-hydro renewables, still only playing a very small role. Coal and gas, very minimal. The UK, on the other hand, has essentially had two transitions away from coal. The first one in the 1990s, this was the dash for gas. This is all driven by the market. Gas became very abundant and very cheap, and so that pushed coal out of the market. The second phase out of coal, which occurred very rapidly after 2013, and the UK is committed to having no coal in its system by 2025. It'll actually happen before that. That looks really great. That doesn't have a lot to do with the Renewable Energy Directive, though. That's more to do with the another EU directive, a large combustion plant directive, which set emission standards on coal plants. If a plant didn't meet that standard, it had 8 years to close, essentially. And you say, so this is essentially where the large combustion plant directive kicks in. So all of these old coal plants, most of them built in the 60s and 70s, were taken offline. They were essentially given an early death. The coal generation in the UK is much older than that in Australia. So what are our conclusions? So in France, the drivers, as I said, these claims to leadership are important, and that engineering and research capacity also has been a driver, but there have been many impediments. So nuclear, we talk about this sort of mesocorporate system where you've got this very small this coordination between that elite within the bureaucracy and within EDF. That favours the incumbents, which is EDF. You also got this dual policy style, which is misaligned at the moment. So you've got the executive committing to these these renewable targets without considering the impact on nuclear. And there's also this conflict between emissions and renewable energy commitments. So if you displace nuclear with renewable energy, you're going to, in France in particular, probably going to have to increase gas as well, so you can meet those winter peaks. And so the transmission operator in France, which has modelled this, would suggest that emissions would actually increase if they were to shut nuclear down early. So France has failed to meet the requirements of the Renewable Energy Directive in the electricity sector. However, if France's dual policy style is aligned, which may happen beyond 2020, I mean, these nuclear plants will eventually have to close, then it may be possible that very centralised system may lead to a very rapid transition. In the UK, drivers, its party competition was very, very important between 2005 and 2008. The dispersed control of the sector means that there's no real entrenched interest, and often the interests of the big energy companies actually cancel each other out. Other policies have been hugely important in the UK, that large combustion plant directive and the carbon price floor, which I didn't talk about much, but that's designed to support the ETS. That's effectively made the continuation of coal completely unviable, and market conditions, so the falling price of renewables. So in the UK, I mean, institutionalism doesn't explain everything. These path dependencies are much weaker. That doesn't explain anything. There's a very important role here for those actors and the political parties. The impediments, this commitment to economic liberalism has at times slowed the transition. There's also been this decline in political salience since 2008, which is evident here as well. So the UK has been better able to meet its electricity sector targets. However, it has already picked the low-hanging fruit. Coal was closing. The policies brought forward that closure, but the 2020s are the crucial decade for the future of the power sector. And given the problems with incentivising generation at the moment in the UK, you're probably going to have to see an increasing level of government intervention within the market to push gas out of the sector, to promote more renewables, more nuclear and CCS. So further research, other sectors, this focus very much on electricity, but transport, heating and cooling are also important. Future targets beyond 2020, of course. The role of nuclear, there's a whole thesis in the nuclear sector. And Brexit, what happens with Brexit? I deliberately didn't mention it. Unfortunately, my thesis only goes up to 2020, so it doesn't affect it. How that will affect the future of UK's energy and climate policy will be very, very interesting. I think I've gone over time. I'm going to finish there. I've gone well over time. John's nodding. Yes, you've gone well over time.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Nick. We're open to questions.
Hi, hi, Nick. Yeah, that was great. Well done.
Thank you.
Do the UK and France share are their grids interconnected with other states?
Yes, yes. And it's actually an increasing role in the UK in particular. They're building a lot more interconnections. So France is a net energy exporter, but because of those winter peaks, it's increasingly having to import power during the winter months. And the EU has an interconnector policy. So every member state has to reach a target of 10% by 2020. No state has actually met that just yet. So France sees that opportunity to export more power. The UK is very happy to import power. And so they're building more connections with France, Belgium and Ireland as well at the moment.
Great talk. what you didn't mention the environmental differences, the state from where they've got water and where they've got sun. How much of a driver is that in looking at what is the environment of each of those member states, setting either opportunities but also limitations?
Yeah, so you turn in terms of renewable energy capacity. Yeah, it's a really interesting question within the EU because so take Germany and Spain's a really good example. So Spain receives 60% more solar radiation than Germany, but Germany has 600% more solar PV capacity. And so this is a sort of a problem the EU is trying to solve in trying to build the capacity where the renewable source exists, and then building and promoting these interconnectors. But electricity is still very much a national industry, and states and so Germany's policy is as much about the environment as it is about industrial policy and energy security. So states are very, very reluctant to build capacity in other countries and then rely on interconnection. So it's sort of a flaw in the EU's model at the moment, and they're trying to solve that, but states are very resistant to it.
Great presentation, Nick. That was really interesting. I was particularly interested in the point about, I guess, sort of one of the big themes sitting behind your research about the kind of role of the state in this transition process. And it seems like you've got really nice examples of one country which is more corporatist and centralized, and one which is liberalized. And obviously that debate's playing out in this country. Different states are taking different approaches to that. So I was wondering what your prescriptions would be based on your kind of research of what's the better approach? Heavy state role versus kind of more liberalized role, or what might the concessions be from either of those extremes?
Okay, I'll say they're different rather than saying one's necessarily better than the other. I said that there are different challenges, obviously. So in the UK, they have had a lot of problems incentivizing generation, and that's going to be a huge problem in the next 10 years in particular. Okay, they've got about 20 gigawatts of coal and nuclear capacity that's due to close in the next 10 years. And so they've got to replace that. Plus, there's probably going to be some increase in electricity demand. And so whether or not this sort of market-based approach will work is a very complex question. It hasn't done so far, and hence you've had to have the government intervene increasingly often to achieve its objectives. In France, initially I thought, okay, France, you've got this very top-down structure. It's very much based on sort of engineering competence. So it should therefore be able to say, well, this is our target. This is what you're going to do. But because the nuclear sector is so embedded within the state, there's been that resistance. But a lot of that is to do with the prioritization of emissions commitments over renewable energy commitments. So what happens beyond 2020 when some of that nuclear capacity starts to close, and whether or not France can therefore transition rapidly is an open question, I think. Yeah, so come back to me in 2030 and I'll have a really good answer for you. I saw my wife going, "You're not writing another thesis." Don't worry, I won't.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Really good piece of research. Well done. It's really an excellent talk. It's fantastic. I'm kind of, just to go back to the start of your thesis and think about what it's about. So when you say it's about Europeanization, it sort of suggests that you're going to say something about the theories of Europeanization. Yeah. Which doesn't sort of seem to be what you really want to say. Yeah. And if it is, then I guess the question is, how much can you say about theories of Europeanization on one sector and two states? Yeah. It seems to me what you really want to be talking about is actually about path dependencies, institutional reform, and Europeanization is sort of almost like a context. Yeah. So European is sort of a question there. So I guess my question is, what would you say about Europeanization? Yeah. So Europeanization is more of a process of this sort of policy development and then implementation. And then I use institutionalization and the path dependency and those sorts of concepts to talk about the process. So Europeanization is not a theory.
It's more of a, as I said, it's more of a process within the EU.
Yeah, but I guess what I'm saying is the way you ask the question of the thesis suggests your conclusions about Europeanization, whereas I
Okay.
your conclusions
Yep.
are much more about path dependency.
Yep.
You know what I mean? Like
Yes,
there's
yeah,
kind
yeah.
of this kind of bifurcated focus, whereas in fact the weight of your evidence is much more about policy styles and path dependency within states than it is about. So you have conclusions, strong, robust evidence supported conclusions about that. You may be on weaker ground saying, and therefore I have strong conclusions about the processes of Europeanization. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, and I know both Phil and Peter have questioned that term and why that's the necessarily the term I use. And I suppose I use that term, I suppose, because it talks about this sort of dual process. So in the thesis, I talk about the development of the Renewable Energy Directive, which I didn't talk about much today, and the influence that France had and UK, and then what the adjustment was, which is that. And then I use that sort of those other concepts to explain how that. Yeah.
Hi, Nick. Thanks. That was super interesting. One of the things that it's hard not to think about this in the context of Australia, and one of the sort of ideas that is always reiterated is about the importance of long-term policy goals for markets to make their decisions. And I wondered, you've got goals in 2030, you've got a long-term goal for 2050 that's about to be set, and I wondered how important your evidence says that actually is in these two cases, that those sort of medium and those long-term goals. Has that really made an impact or not so much?
Hugely so, I think. Well, I mean, you're talking about Australia, you probably compare it to the UK. And one of the reasons I chose UK was because it's somewhat similar to Australia. You have to acknowledge that this notion that UK is an island of coal on a sea of gas isn't reality anymore. So there's no coal mining. They've been a net importer of gas for the last 10 years or so. Whereas Australia, obviously, you've got these really entrenched interests in the resources sector. So I have to acknowledge that first. But yeah, there's been very little resistance from the energy companies in the UK, or even from industry, to these very ambitious policies. And one of the reasons I think is because it sets a very long-term target. One of the really interesting policies I do talk about in the thesis is that large combustion plant directive, which had a real influence on the closure of coal in the UK. So essentially what it did was, in 2000, it was set in 2007, it set an 8-year time frame. And it said, you've got 8 years to meet this emission standard. If you don't meet that standard, you then have a limited number of hours to operate, 20,000 hours, which I think is about 2 years or thereabouts. So the owners of these coal plants essentially had 10 years to make an investment decision on whether they continue with those coal plants, whether they retrofit them, or whether they just shut them down. And that's why you didn't have a lot of resistance from the owners of those coal plants. And in fact, they've actually been quite supportive of these sorts of policies. So I think the UK example shows it's hugely important to offer that. Whether we have that applied in Australia, I'm not too sure. Yeah, good luck.
Thank you, Nick. Fantastic presentation again. I would have two questions, one about sovereignty and the other one about tying into the Australian example. About sovereignty, the UK always was the country in the EU that held sovereignty as the utmost value to be preserved in the European debates. Mm-hmm. How do you think the UK falling away within the EU would influence future policy making in the renewable energy field when sovereignty, either other member states have to step up to the place of holding sovereignty high up, or it is becomes less of an issue? So sovereignty is the first question. And then on the parallel with Australia, apart from the resources curse that Australia is burdened with, what is the fundamental difference between the Tories and Boris Johnson in his first speech now in Parliament mentioned the net zero target in 2050. Climate change is out there. It's a national heritage tied in with that, but it's really, it seems like a core value of the Tories. What other differences do you see there with in comparison with Australia other than the resources curse?
Okay, so you sound like Boris Johnson when you say sovereignty so often. So in terms of, what's that? So you mean what the impact of Brexit will be on EU and UK policy? Is that the first part of the question? Yeah. So, yeah, good question. I don't know. And you know, it's interesting. When I was in Brussels conducting interviews last year, and whilst Brexit was not part of my thesis, I always ask the question at the end of the interview, you know, what impact will Brexit have? And in Brussels, it was essentially don't know, don't care. And it's still the case because the UK has been unable to articulate what its relationship with the EU will be beyond the 31st of October. It's really uncertain what this will mean for climate and energy policy. And there's sort of two trains of thought. The first is that the UK has actually been quite ambitious since 2005. It has driven more ambition within the EU. And it has, because it's got fairly good relationships with Poland in particular, it's actually been able to push Poland a little bit. So there's an argument that once the EU is out of, once the UK is out of the EU, it will be able to implement those stronger policies that it has been advocating behind doors in EU negotiations. The other side of the coin is that after Brexit, if there's a hard Brexit and there's an economic crash, while the UK is going to want to make its industries more competitive, so it's going to scrap all of these renewable energy incentive schemes, is want to drive down power prices, scrap environmental regulations, et cetera, et cetera. But it really is an open question. It's quite remarkable that we're 3 months out from Brexit and these questions still haven't been fully answered. So yeah, on that one, it's still a question mark. There's lots of you know, one of the strange things. So Northern Ireland is part of the single market with the Republic of Ireland, and that's based on the common EU rulebook. So what happens when Northern Ireland is pulled out of the EU, and all of a sudden a lot of those rules don't align anymore? All these things are not entirely clear yet. So I'm giving a very vague answer, but that's the only answer that I've heard. And in terms of the difference between the Tories and the Liberal Party here, it's one is just really sliding doors, mate. What happened if Tony Abbott didn't beat Malcolm Turnbull in that vote? He lost by a vote. What happens if Turnbull had still been in power and we then had a bipartisan climate policy with Rudd and Turnbull? I'm not entirely sure. So this is where there is a real role for sort of ideas and actors that sort of sits outside of this institutional framework. You had just this sort of remarkable confluence of factors in the UK between 05 and 08. You know, Blair obviously wanting to establish a legacy, Cameron wanting to distance himself from Thatcher. You had Gordon Brown as well, trying to undermine Blair, thinking, well, I need to be strong on climate policy as well. So he was one of the key drivers behind the Stern Review as well. So there's sort of these sort of factors that occur within the sort of the party competition. But also, I mentioned those interests within Australia. That's huge. I think being the largest exporter of coal and gas, whereas the UK is dependent on exports. So there was no entrenched interest in the resource sector influencing policy. I think they're the two biggest differences.
G'day. I'm not an academic, so bear with me. But in your talk, the treaties and the agreements and the discussion of policy between Britain and France has basically been about generation and capacity of the various electricity systems. But I'm just interested to know, has there been any policy development and agreement and difference in policies between the provision of storage, which I know this is probably a bit off topic, but the way I see it, storage is the big potential killer in this whole green problem. It's a technical issue, but it's very, very important and will become more important as the green generators become more powerful and dominate the system and the nuclear generators are decommissioned. So has there been any international work or any comparative work between Britain and France with respect to the issue of storage?
Yeah, no, there's no EU policy at the moment, but it's obviously something that's growing everywhere. one of the interesting things in the UK is that they had a strategy that would involve a very large share for nuclear power. They've had a lot of problems finding people to build this nuclear power. So all of a sudden, there's a lot more talk about storage and carbon capture and storage. So they're investing a lot more in that, realizing that their nuclear strategy perhaps isn't as viable as they first thought. And in France, I mean, they've got an existing hydro capacity, some of which is pumped hydro. But EDF has always been really resistant to sort of distributed energy and small scale solar. You know, even up until today, they talk about it a lot, but there's not a lot of development. There is some development within the research agency, the CEA, which began life as a nuclear research agency. They've now attached a sort of a particular research body looking at solar and storage to that. But in terms of EU policy, there's nothing specific in terms of agreements.
Okay. I'm mindful of the time. We've got time for one more question, Dylan.
Thanks, great stuff. Again, I guess bring it back to Australia. Some of the stuff you've talked about seems directly comparable to, at least from my perspective, directly comparable to the sort of COAG Energy Council in terms of the Europeanization. We have the states, you know, variously doing their own things. We have COAG Energy Council. We've seen sort of policy percolate up from different states and then come back down. I don't know if this is a good parallel, but it sort of seems like if you think about Victoria being like the United Kingdom, went very far down the liberalisation pathway, and it's now actually doing some of the things that the UK does, like contracts for difference, etc. Sort of a return of the state in some respect. And you contrast that to, say, Queensland, where it's very much state-owned generation, and they're actually, you know, they've got 2 state-owned generators, and now they're I guess introducing CleanCo, a new state-owned generator. So in my mind, these are very similar dynamics. So I'd be interested to hear your perspective on that in the, I guess, the Australian, you know, competitive federalism, or however you want to think about it. And I don't know if there's any lessons we can learn that through this, you know, Europeanization, but for that particular Australian context.
Yeah, there's another thesis in that too. I think that would be a good comparison, actually, because in the EU has tried for a very long time to increase its competence over energy policy, right? So it sees a single energy market as a sort of completion of the EU project. But for a very long time, states have held very tight control over energy policy because it's so closely tied to these notions of sovereignty and state power, etc. So I suppose there's probably a similar dynamic there in Australia. You've got the Commonwealth, which is increasing its competence. Part of it is necessary because as you develop this NEM, I suppose.
It's not increasing its competence.
It's attempting to, maybe, yeah. But I mean, you know, because you've now got a national grid, there's probably more need for federal control of that. And it's sort of similar in the EU because they're encouraging these interconnections. And if you do that, then you have to develop these common rules, and they can only be established at the EU level. But there's this real tension between the EU's objective of establishing a single energy market and these states retaining control over their energy markets. And a lot of that's tied to also energy security concerns from the 1970s. States are very reluctant to be relying on their neighbours, even though there's all these many cooperative arrangements within the EU. So perhaps the states in Australia are somewhat similar to that. I'm not too sure. And then that other question of you've got certain states with greater ambition that are sort of running ahead of the supranational, the federal body, which you have. And so a question of whether the EU or the federal government is actually restraining some of the ambition of these member states. And to some extent that's happening, but as long as you've got member states making their own decisions, you've got inefficiencies in the market. Like I talked about that, you know, the German and Spanish example. You've got certain countries building over capacity, you know, because they don't want to rely on imports from other countries. So yeah, I think there are a lot of similar issues between those two jurisdictions.
Terrific. Nick faces the wonderful challenge of finishing his thesis before we know what the answer to the Brexit question might be. So the final chapter is going to be particularly exciting to write and to read. I hope it's not going to end up in the space of this thesis that I'm aware of that was written about the joys of market socialism in the Soviet Union, which was completed 3 weeks before the Soviet Union collapsed. The thesis was actually found in a skip. It was used by a very famous Russian photographer, Mikhailov's, to print photographs of the post-Soviet Russia on back of the pages. This is not the fate of Nick's thesis. I hope you'll join me in congratulating him in the presentation and in wishing him well as the rush to completion continues. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Excellent.
Sorry, while I have you all, if I can give you a plug for next week's seminar, which is a Wednesday at 11 a.m. We have Ed Hawkins talking about the sensitivity of historical climate simulations to uncertain aerosol forcing. And Ed's a great speaker as well, so that should be a good one.
I think that's my job, isn't it? Seminar coordinator. Yeah, sorry.